Hello, and welcome to the Flute 360 podcast, where we incorporate a panoramic view of flute-related topics. I am your host, Heidi K. Begay, and this is episode 46, Competition Repertoire Guides with Christine Beard and Matt Smith. Today's episode is sponsored by J&K Productions. They produce all of my episodes, from adding the intro and outro music to editing the audio and all post-production needs. Contact them for your next podcast project at jkproductions.media. Welcome everyone to another episode of the Flute 360 podcast. Today I'm talking with composer Matt Smith and piccoloist Christine Beard. We're going to discuss Matt's Sonata No. 2 for piccolo and piano, which was composed in 2006. Today we're going to talk about a formal analysis and some performance suggestions given by the composer himself and Christine Beard, who premiered it at the University of Nebraska at Omaha in 2007. Welcome, you two.
Thanks very much for having us. Really pleased to be here. Thanks. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, yes, of course. I really appreciate your guys' time, and I can't wait to pick your brain, Matt and Christy, about this piece. So let's dive right on in. And Matt, I'm going to give you the floor. Go ahead and tell me and the audience how you were inspired to write this piece. Was it a commission? What's the background of your Sonata No. 2?
So the Sonata No. 2 was sort of devised after premiering Sonata No. 1 at the Guildhall School of Music, where I was studying at the time. And I really loved writing my first sonata. And the people at Guildhall were asking me, can I write something for our annual piccolo concert, which my professor at Guildhall, Sarah Newbold, sort of took up the reins of doing every year. So originally, when the first performance was given by Fiona Patterson and Rosie Richardson, there was only 2 movements of this. So we had the first 2 movements, and then there was a third movement waiting to be written. What I really wanted to try and do with this sonata was give the piccolo some expressive time and utilize the sound and try and allow the performer to blend with the piano, especially in the first movement. And really the idea of it is all sort of based around this unsettled, uneasy feeling of, first of all, am I sure about what I'm writing? And then I suppose where I was in my life at the time, where am I going? What am I doing? And really this whole first movement is based around that feeling and that sort of emotion, which I hope comes across in it. I certainly feel uneasy whenever I listen to it back. And having the opportunity to listen to it recently and for this podcast as well, certainly kind of brought me back to when I was writing it. I think I must have been 22 at the time when I was writing it. So still at Guildhall and still kind of trying to find out what it was that I wanted to be doing. So yeah, that's really the background to it. Fiona Patterson premiered it along with Rosie at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama. And then Christy did the American premiere in August of 2007. I actually did a performance of it as well in an Ian Clark flute class at Guildhall. We had a chance to play, and Ian knew I'd finished the piece and wanted to give me a platform to do a performance as well, which was great as well. I really enjoyed playing it and performing it. Something I haven't done for ages, actually, which I really should. So that's the background of it. I hope that kind of gives it some kind of context.
Yeah, that's great. So when we were scheduling this interview, I was surprised to know and to find out that you and Christy are actually really good friends.
Yeah, I mean, when did we meet, Christy? Online. What year was it? I sort of sent you a sort of groveling email saying, "Oh, Christy, I've seen your website. Would you consider looking at Sonata No. 1? When was that?
It must have been no later than 2003, I think, because I was a pretty new professor at the University of Nebraska at Omaha when I received that email, and I think you were like 17 at the time, maybe.
I think it was something like that, wasn't it? Yeah. I can't quite remember. I can't even remember the year, but we've known each other for a long time now. So I think I still have the emails. Actually, I think I sent them to you. Actually, didn't I? So yeah, it's been a while that we've known each other, and Christine did the first performance of the piece, of Sonata No. 1 back then. And then basically I've just been kind of just sending her annoying piccolo works for the last however long. And she's been good enough to entertain the idea of playing them for me, which is very nice of her.
How fun. What a great background. So Christy, do you remember Matt reaching out to you for this particular piece?
I do. Actually, it was the first sonata that he first proposed to me. And the email was really cute because he was, all of about 17 at the time. And he was saying, he's a student composer and he'd love for me to look at some of his works. And he attached the score. And I responded very politely, sure, I'd love to take a look at it. And I get emails like that pretty often. And sometimes it's music that I don't really have any interest in. But I went ahead and took a look at the piece and I started playing through it. And I really heard something in that music, which is why I decided to go ahead and do the premiere of the first sonata, or the American premiere of the first sonata. And then he wrote again about the second sonata. And I was like, yes, please send it to me. And it was even better than the first one that he sent. So I do remember those correspondences very fondly. And it really was the building stages for this really great friendship that we have now, about 16 years later.
Wow.
Oh my goodness, is it that long? 17 years when it's been, I can't believe it. It's incredible. It's amazing sending, I think we've had this conversation before, Chrissy, just sending one email can lead to just this wormhole of experience opening up. It's just been such a huge amount of fun so far doing all of the pieces that we have. And it's just led us to really interesting places and all over the world, which is amazing.
Yeah.
Really, really, really cool.
Yeah, I know this is a bit of a tangent, but I mean, we really have been all over the world together. The first time we met in person was when I gave the NFA premiere of this Sonata No. 2, and he came to New York. But actually, our meeting was really brief. It was literally like a handshake and, hi, it's so great to meet you. And then we had to split in opposite directions. And so we didn't really get to know each other until a couple years later. And he flew to Slovenia to be at a festival for the Piccolo Festival when I was performing there. And I actually wasn't even performing any of his music. And then you met me in Spain at one point when I was doing a festival performance there. And I've had him in Omaha, and I've been at his house and met his kids. And it's just, like I said, it's just turned into this really wonderful relationship. I kind of lovingly refer to him as my kid brother.
Yeah, you're definitely big sister. It's really turned into that relationship, and it's just it's so amazing. Like I say, where you stand at the edge of a wormhole of experience and you see where it takes you, and it's been incredible, really, really, really amazing.
How neat! And it just shows you how small the music community really is.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I say, the power of just contacting one person online, and just to kind of go, oh, would you be interested? And here we are, 17 years later, on a podcast, talking to each other, as if we we haven't seen each other for absolutely ages, but it's everlasting friendship. It's amazing.
That gives me goosebumps. That is so cool. So if you'd like to, let's go ahead and dive into Movement 1, since it's the NFA requirement for the flute choir competition. It's for the professional flute choir, and it's the piccolo option. So everyone can do the Prelude and Scherzo by Brusser. And if they want to audition for a specific alternate instrument like piccolo, alto, your piece is the piccolo option. So Movement 1 is the NFA requirement, and I can't wait to see what you have to say, Matt and Christy, about this piece.
Great. So what I was trying to set up at the beginning of Movement 1 is this slightly uneasy, unstable chord, and then for the piccolo over the first couple of bars measures to blend with the piano they're playing unison, and I just wanted the chance for piccolo and piano to work together on exactly the same musical theme, and just set the scene of this slightly dream sequency, unsettled, unsure piece that then entails. There's in measure 2, there is for performance directions, there is a chance to take a breath there. I have no problem with the breath being taken after the first quaver of measure 2, but as legato as you possibly can, and as careful with balance with piano as you possibly can over those first 2 bars, and also allow the first chord on the first quaver, the first 8th note, to just settle and ring before you come in on those first 2 bars, 2 measures. And then when the con motto starts, the piano just weaves its way through the opening introduction, setting up this very unsettled, uneasy feel. And the first piccolo entry of the con motto, the dotted crotchet or dotted quarter note, equals 84 section, where it's marked MP dolce, I really want the piccolo to shimmer, maybe with a very light bib on that D, so that it cuts through the texture that's been set up. And then in measure 8, over the 3 quarter notes at the end of the bar, just slightly hesitant on the tenutos through there, before allowing the lyrical long notes to just take over again in measure 9. A breath mark also at the end of bar 11. And then with this sort of slightly shorter piccolo section here with longer notes, it leads into a writ in measure 13. And if anything, it becomes even more unsettled and nervous through the writ into the neno mosso section. I deliberately mark quaver equals 160 just so that performers get the idea that the music really has definitely slowed down there and should be felt in 9, and allow the time for the semiquavers to settle in the piccolo part of measure 14. Me and Christy have had discussions over the trill at the end of bar 14, haven't we, Christy?
We have, and I don't remember what we settled on.
Yeah, the last note of measure 14, I've got it in the score. It should be as written. There's an E sharp in the bar, and it should be E sharp to F sharp of that trill. And then in measure 15, it goes back to an E natural on the second note of that one. I'm hoping that's making sense for everybody. But with this section, I mark it delicate because I really want as careful and as slightly nervous as you can get through this section. It should be very uneasy, very unsure. It's like you're tiptoeing your way through life, not quite knowing exactly where you're heading. And this really goes for all of this section through to measure 18, where there's an accelerando marked. And that accelerando really is just back up to the original tempo of the con motto, and should just be measured through those 2 bars with a crescendo. And then when you get to the a tempo at measure 20, I just want as much lyricism and as much singing on the piccolo as you can muster. And that really happened. The singing idea really stays all the way through then, from measure 20 all the way through to measure 24, where there is a certain amount of tension gathered again, leading us into the long note in bar 25. The ascending sequence through there just builds and then releases into the C sharp minor section in measure 25. The lyricism then returns sort of almost immediately with the piccolo running up the scale into measure 27 as smooth as you possibly can. And then enjoy the dissonance and the uneasy feel between the G sharp and the G naturals all the way through there. For me, there's a breath mark at the end of measure 29. And that kind of leads us into the tune returning at measure 31. And that really is the kind of opening section of the movement all the way through to 35, where the piano starts to set its uneasy feel again back to kind of B minor, down to the next the next pause at bar 38, which is one of these moments where the piano just needs to maybe unwind slightly. And then at the pause mark, I really want the player to take a moment for the music to stop and then come in as expressively and as beautifully as you can on the G sharp in measure 38, the quarter note G sharp, and enjoy the fact that the piano is actually with you on those crotchets. They divide into crotchet beats in that bar as well. And then just allow the piano to ring on the A major 7 chord at the end of measure 39. This kind of stop-start feel happens at this point. So just it's kind of relaxed. You've got this nice warm harmony happening, but there's always this sense of unease throughout the movement. And the pause marks that happen, really do take some time. Don't be afraid to allow a moment's silence. Also try and really enjoy when you have rests in bar 42, the piano sinking into the A major 7 chord again, all the way through from bar 42. And then the piccolo joins back in at 44, decorating the melody. The next section where I deliberately put the semiquavers against the piano, I do that to emphasize the feeling of unease. It's not just there to make your life difficult. The beaming, the beaming really is supposed to be deliberate so that you do emphasize the beginning, the third, eighth note in every group of 3 in the compound time signature. So, it's very, very deliberate, to do that. And I really want people to get that across, ideally not affecting the actual rhythm of the semiquavers as well, just a slight nudge on each one, just to kind of take the edge off of where the beat is. I know that makes it difficult to play. I know as a performer as well, I sit there sometimes thinking, why have I written this just to make my life difficult? But it is very deliberate, and it's not just a composer being slightly pretentious, which I know I get accused of quite often by my wife. But it's very much to try and allow the rhythmic development of the piece to happen. And it goes against the beat all the way through to 49, where the piano then comes in on the last quarter dotted note of 49 and establishes the beat again with our tune. And then we build through 50 into 51, where we are at the most expressive we can possibly get through this section. I don't know if, Christy, have you noticed in the piano part in your draft copy, do you have Alex's modulation written in at 53?
I do, actually.
You do, yeah. That section, I was sort of thinking, where can I take this melody again? And I played it to Alex, and I was a bit afraid that it was a bit too much, slightly too cheesy, slightly too happy at that precise moment. But Alex really, really liked it, and she was like, "You have to leave it in like that." So I thought I'd just write into the score Alex's modulation, just to kind of, if anybody's accusing me of being far too chippy and too happy at that particular moment, far too jolly, it's Alex's fault, and I've just blamed my wife for that one. So that's the idea behind that section. But as beautiful as you possibly can, really enjoy the octave jumps in the middle of the bar as well, as smooth as you possibly can. And then just allow the piece to unwind into 55. The melody comes back. We start getting the material at the beginning appearing again, although this time in A major. And then heading towards the end of the movement, bars 58 into 59, this is where B minor's becoming established again. And just in bar 59, there is just a hint of a quote of the main theme of Sonata No. 1, where I am just thinking back to what I wrote at that precise moment. It's only 6 notes of it, from the F sharp in measure 59. And it just hints at the previous sonata. There's a pause at the end of bar 60, allow the time to settle. The piano does this for you. And then as you come in on 63, it's not marked in the score, but I just want this slightly sense of unwinding into the last couple of bars. And with a pause on the last note, just enjoy the D sharp that comes in the bottom octave of the piano, and hold that note for as long as you dare, and allow the piece to die away into the second movement.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that overview. I'm glad you referenced the trill, because when I was preparing for today's interview, I circled that and put a question mark. I didn't know if it went to the F sharp or F natural, but it's an E sharp, so that doesn't make sense. But yeah, I was just making sure that it does go from E sharp to F sharp.
Yeah, definitely. And when you said about doing this, that was almost the first thought that came to my head. I was like, oh, that trill's going to come up. So I have looked through it again and just made sure that is actually what I wanted. And it's definitely an E sharp to an F sharp. So yes, me and Christy have had that conversation before. So I was wondering if you were going to pick up on it. So I'm really glad I managed to figure it out before you asked me and say it. So yeah, indeed.
Perfect. So Christy, if you could tell us performance suggestions for movement 1, any trick piccolo fingerings, anything that you've learned about this piece as you've prepared it?
Well, as I mentioned, it's been about probably 9 years or so since I have last performed this piece. So it's been a while. I was listening to my video on YouTube, and I'm not 100% sure that I played all the right notes as we're talking about these trills and things, because there's just so many accidentals. So I think the first thing that I would just tell everybody to do is to be sure to really look at the accidentals that are in each measure and make sure that you're accounting for them all the way through the bar, so that you know if it's going to be an E sharp that's left over from beat 1, or if it actually changes to a different note. And that happens in several places. So just really take the time to double check your accidentals. Aside from that, I think one of the things that I love about playing Matt's music is when you listen to him talk about his writing for the piccolo and how much he uses the words expressive and singing, which are not necessarily terms that a lot of people equate to piccolo playing, but he's, writing this music with that kind of idea behind it. And so that's what I really try to bring to his pieces when I play them, and this one is no exception. So just going into it from that perspective of trying to be as expressive as possible and try to sing with your tone as much as you can, I think is really going to go a long way in this piece. Matt mentioned at the beginning the opening being in unison with the piano, and I remember spending quite a bit of time working out this intonation, because not only is it in unison with the piano, but it's also hovering around that middle D natural, which is one of the more out of tune notes on most piccolos. So you really have to have a good sense about where your intonation sits on your instrument. And also, I would say, make sure that you practice with the piano, the actual instrument that you are going to be using for your recording of this movement, because you need to know where that piano's intonation sits for those notes as well. But then I would also say that, try as much as you can to blend the two sounds together. Yes, you are the soloist, but I don't really think of Matt's music as being piccolo solo with a piano accompaniment. It's very much a collaboration between the two instruments. And so rather than the piccoloist always thinking about them being on the fore of the sound, I think it really needs to be a blend in a lot of places, and the beginning would be no exception to that idea. And feel free to jump in if you totally disagree with something that I say, Matt.
No, I completely agree with what you're saying. I was going to ask you a question actually about the fingering at the beginning for that D. Mm-hmm. Do you ever recommend anybody leave their first finger on for the D to bring the pitch down on those notes? Because I know that I've done that before in performances where I've had a very, very sharp D, and it does really bring them down. Would you recommend someone in this case do that? Or are we worried too much about the change in timbre from the harmonic?
For me, I don't particularly like that trick. I've heard other players talk about that. I don't necessarily think that it is a good option just because it does change the tone quality. At least to my ears, I can hear it. If I'm in the other room and somebody leaves a finger on that first D. So I think that you can actually work to make that note in tune without having to resort to a fingering trick. You just have to make sure that I like practicing in the mirror and really watching to see what I'm doing with my embouchure to make the sound that I want, the intonation that I want. In a pinch, I don't know what I want to say about that. It's not my favorite trick to use in the book. I think that there's better ways to handle the intonation on that D, but for me, everything is about the sound quality that I want. So if I had to choose between playing it a little bit out of tune or making a beautiful sound, or not even just a beautiful sound, but the sound that I want to make, I would choose the sound over the intonation.
Yeah, I would agree with you as well. I'd always obviously much rather hear it as the proper note. I was sitting looking at it and you mentioned the tuning of the note, and I know that I've seen that trick written in lots of orchestral things before. And for me, I do much prefer the proper fingering for the D. It does stick out, especially in a solo piece. I think it is probably better to try and just keep it in tune.
Yeah.
Without resorting to the trick. So just thought I'd throw that one in there as I sat and thought of it.
Yeah, that could be a really long discussion. I think that, also because this is so exposed and so thin in the beginning, I mean, it's just the octave, there's nothing else going on, that you can perhaps help with any little intonation issues that you have by also varying the vibrato. If you want to do it more straight tone, or if you want to add some vibrato on certain notes, that can also help you to work the intonation a little bit. I know that there's going to be some controversy from that statement too, but from listeners, but it can help to hide just little tiny bits of intonation issues depending on how you handle the vibrato sometimes.
Yeah, going back to what Christy said earlier about how Matt writes really well for the instrument and how the piano part and the flute part fit beautifully together, I couldn't agree more, because when I was going through the first movement for today and playing it, what I wrote down at the top of my copy is that the composition and the writing for this particular instrument, the piccolo, the range is comfortable, and just the musical line and the musical sense, it was very comfortable for me as a piccoloist to absorb this piece. I don't know if that rings true to you, Christy, but that's my first impression when going through this sonata.
I definitely think that it is in a very good range for the instrument. There's obviously some very advanced qualities to performing this piece, some advanced things that have to come out as a player. But in terms of the range of the instrument, somebody who is not that experienced on the piccolo could easily pick up this piece and work it out, because you're not expected to have to sustain really high notes at soft dynamics. And it also gives you a chance to really work on getting that low register to be really singing and beautiful and focused. So I would agree with you in that standpoint.
Yeah, and even the low range, what you just said too, that was my second comment I wrote at the top of my score. I love the use of the low range, because I think that range for us as piccoloists is beautiful, and it's not usually showcased a lot.
Absolutely. One of the things that I work with my students when they're trying to learn to be more proficient on piccolo is really trying to focus that low register and not just letting the piccolo do what it wants to do, which is typically to be thin in that low register and to have less presence of sound. And so when I show them how it can actually be more focused, more present, more flute-like, usually I get the really surprised look the first time that they're able to achieve that on their own, and oh wow, this actually can be like the flute is. And I think that's important for really defining yourself as a piccolo player and not necessarily a flutist who also happens to play piccolo.
Excellent. So Christy, if you have any more comments on movement 1, I'd love to hear those comments.
Yeah, this piece, as we were just talking about, it's a great piece for even the intermediate piccolo player to delve into from a tonal aspect. There are some challenges that are presented by the piece. He likes to play with that syncopation, as he was referring to earlier, as being this kind of wandering, I'm not sure what's going on kind of feeling. And he really exploits that throughout the piece. And I would dare say it's almost like a signature trait of his compositional style throughout the other piccolo sonatas as well. But you have to be careful with the syncopations and with the hemiolas that he creates to make sure that you're really placing them properly and that you're not misaccentuating them. That he, as he spoke of going into bar 47, making sure that you play those groupings as a 6-note grouping, starting from the very first 16th note and not putting stress where the beats actually are. But I will say that when I first learned this piece, I remember practicing it very strictly, putting accents where the beats actually fall, because that's where the piano is stressing. And so to really feel comfortable with where I was in the pattern with where the piano was going to be giving stress. And then once I got comfortable with it that way, and then just moving the stress over to the beginning of the group helped me to be able to play that with the piano part underneath without me needing to follow the piano, if that made sense.
Yeah, that's a great tip.
And then also throughout this movement, I'm noticing I have a lot of little notes to myself about switching back and forth. I tend to almost always use the real F sharp fingering for the middle F sharp or F sharp 2. But there are occasions where it might be helpful to switch to, the forked fingering or the trill fingering, especially when you're going back and forth between an E and an F sharp. So don't be afraid to try those different fingerings out. For me, sometimes even in the course of the same pattern, I might use one fingering the first time the F sharp comes around and then switch to the forked fingering the next time it comes around, or vice versa, because that sometimes also helps me to keep the group itself more even rather than using the same fingering throughout the entire passage. So I would just, tell players to try out those different patterns and see if that helps them to play it more evenly, or if it just helps it to seem more fluid.
No, I agree. That's awesome. Really good suggestion. Anything else, Matt or Christy, that you would like to mention about movement 1 in particular?
I think from my point of view, I'm always, when I'm writing, trying to communicate a feeling, a sense of something. And everything that Christy's been saying is really helpful in getting that idea in this movement across of that sense of unease. I know that's where my kind of musical compositional voice comes from, is that I have to be emotionally engaged with what I'm writing, and be able to feel those emotions as I'm writing it. And I remember at the time when I was writing this, that sense of unease in life, where you're figuring out where you live, what do you do, where are you going, what are you going to do with your life? Am I going to be a composer? Am I going to be a flute player? I'm not sure. I've still made up my mind on that one. But that sense of unease coming through, and everything that Christy's saying about how to go about accessing that with vibrato, and the way the piece is lyrical, and the piccolo needs to sing as much as possible. All of that is so important as to getting what I wanted across with the movement.
The last thing I would say, especially having not performed this for a while and going back and listening to that recording that I did back in like 2008 or 9, wherever that was, is that going along with what Matt was just saying about the unease and unsettled, that I think really also taking the time in the rests and in the spaces that he creates, whether it be on fermatas or just having silences, to really allow those to be as long as they need to be. And that's probably one thing that I would go back and change about my performance that's on YouTube, is that I feel like sometimes I'm perhaps rushing through some of those moments a little bit too much. And maybe it's just because I'm older now and I have a little bit more patience and can just kind of be relaxed in that silence. But we do tend to rush through silences too much. It makes us uncomfortable. And we need to make sure that those have a life of their own, and that they actually make a statement.
Nice. I don't think you could have said that any better.
Thank you.
Perfect. So moving on to movement 2?
Yeah, certainly, yeah. Shall I go for it?
That would be great.
So movement 2 is starting a little bit in terms of relationship to the first sonata, of allowing the piccolo a moment by itself to play expressively and with a real sense of direction, and allowing the performer to access the nice range of the piccolo, the really pretty range. And what I was trying to do at the beginning was just set the scene, allow the piccolo to set the scene with this opening 6 bars. And then when the piano comes in, the same idea is repeated, and the piano is just decorating this very simple theme. It starts to develop from around about bar 8. We get some slightly more quaver movement in the piccolo part. The piano is still very chordal with some quite kind of deep chords in the left hand of the piano, sort of fourths and fifths, slightly kind of organy feel through this section. And looking at the score, that I'm sort of looking at what I wrote, and the use of I'm kind of using fourths in the bass, which obviously is leading to quite an unstable chord. But the thought process behind all of that is just to try and allow the piccolo this expressive, beautiful character, but always with this slight sense of unease coming through in the piano part. And that really is the whole idea behind the opening 14 measures of this movement, is expressive lyrical playing in the piccolo. And then from 15 onwards, the piccolo takes on a very, very different character. At 15, I actually mark in piano but nasty. I really want a very hard-edged, nasal, slightly aggressive, and really quite on edge in terms of mood. And all the piccolo is doing is just decorating the simple melody in the right hand of the piano. But those two bars really do give it a sort of an edge that hasn't been there in the piccolo part yet. It doesn't last very long. It's only those two bars, but it's this sudden change of temperament, that again, that sense of unease, that sense of where am I going, what am I doing, that sense is always cutting through this piece, I think. And from 17 onwards, the piccolo takes over the lyrical melody again. What I would say is, where there is a writ, really do try and make sure you play the writ as much as we possibly can, and enjoy the dissonances created in the piano part. At the con motto in bar 21, the piano takes over for a moment, again to slightly set everybody ill at ease with this idea of where I am in my life at that moment and what I'm writing. You can look at the melody and say that it actually should be in a 4/4 time signature, but I deliberately keep it in 3 just to disguise where the bar line is, just to try and keep everybody slightly second guessing as to what's going on. And when the piccolo comes back in at 27, the piccolo part at that point is at first really quite a complicated thing to play. When you break it down, actually, what you're playing has already happened. That's already happened, or is it further on? It's the same kind of idea that you get. If you stop the octave jumps, you just get the triplet figure going F sharp, G sharp, A, da da dee, da da dee. The octave jumps again are just meant to set the piece ill at ease. It does make it quite tricky to play, especially with the rhythms in the piano part going on. And again, it's just this flitting between being settled up and unsettled that I'm trying to get across in all of this second movement. And moving further on into the movement from 31 onwards, again, incredibly lyrical. And when we get to 33, the piccolo starts with staccato figures. Again, the same idea as the nasty, take the staccato as written, literally don't be shy about playing the staccato, and then enjoy the fact that the piano just drops out at 35 and you're left with the triplet figure, now not just octaves, but with some melodic idea in there as well. And through 36, take the rowl as slow in tempo as you like, and again, enjoy the chord that's placed on beat 3 of that measure. It's supposed to lull people into a slight false sense of security, this movement, as to, is it going to end? When is it going to end? I sort of deliberately changed the key for a few bars to try and establish something perhaps slightly more optimistic, and with D major established in measure 37. But it kind of doesn't stay there very long, and we head back to our C sharp minor feel in bar 41. The piece, I do, one thing in 43, and this is sort of relatively important to the piece because it's quoted later on in movement 3. Bar 43 of the movement 2, where we get the F sharp to F sharp. I mark it piano, I know as a piccolo player as well that's hard, but is also playable at the same time. And I really want as big a dynamic contrast as you can manage there between 41, forte, cantabile, and molto legato, and then 43, piano with the crescendo down through those two bars, and really again enjoy. You should be at your loudest point hard, but you should be at your loudest point at 45, a measure 45, and then the piece fades away. Me and Christy can now debate the low C sharp that I write in. I wrote originally "Pretend you're playing the C sharp" with the piano doing it, but Christy actually suggested the trick of putting your little finger over the edge of the end of the piccolo and focusing the note down onto the C sharp. So she's got credit for that one. Originally, I was just going to get them to pretend to play it. But that's what happens at the end. You try and play the low C sharp. I don't actually mind if it's out of tune, to be honest with you. I kind of like the C sharp being there, pushing the piccolo to its limits, and seeing if you can get it vaguely in the right area. But the slight out of tuneness on the C sharp doesn't bother me in many respects, because it just adds to that feeling of what am I doing, what's going on, where am I going in life. So yeah, that's the second movement.
Perfect. Christy, would you like to talk about performance suggestions?
I certainly will, and I'll start by talking about that low C sharp at the end of the movement that leads us into the third movement. I was always afraid when I first got the piece that the audience would feel like you were trying to get out a note and it just wasn't speaking, so I appreciated the idea that Matt had about pretending to play the note, but I was like, but it is playable. You can actually get this note out. And, but in order to facilitate that, you do have to break the slur. So don't be afraid if you do want to actually make that C sharp speak, that you go ahead and put a break between the D sharp and the C sharp. And you can really aptly place it to where it sounds like that's intentional and it works from a pacing standpoint if you do enough retard to make that flow correctly. But I think you should at least strive to try to get the C sharp out, even if it's not in tune, as Matt suggested. Going back to the beginning of the piece, this has to be probably my favorite slow movement of not just Matt's piccolo pieces, but one of my favorite slow movements of any piccolo piece that I know. I just think it's absolutely beautiful. I love the fact that you get to play alone at the beginning. I remember thinking that the way that I wanted to approach the opening of the second movement was that I'm a piccolo player and I'm all alone and I'm sad. Nobody wants to play with me because I'm a piccolo player, And so I wanted to show through the growth of the opening statement but I can play beautifully. Listen to this sound. And then finally the pianist comes in and joins you because they're so enticed by, the beautiful melody that you have just performed, and they want to be a part of what you're doing. So you can certainly come up with your own idea of what you want to think about when you're playing that phrase. But I just liked the idea of starting off kind of sounding lonely, but wanting to show how beautiful the instrument could be. When you start this movement, I think it's helpful to make sure that you don't have any kind of bumps or glitches or anything finger-wise that's going to trip you up getting from the C sharp to the D sharp. I do like to start this C sharp with the right hand keys down so that it minimizes how many fingers you're going to have to move getting into the D sharp, and that just helps to keep it more legato and more smooth. When you start to get into the music at 11, as Matt was saying, this is just embellishing the melody that's being sounded literally again in the piano part. And so I have marked less in my part. Again, I'm working off a manuscript. I don't have a published copy of this, so I'm not sure. Matt, do you have an actual dynamic change for the piccolo at 11 from what you had at 7? At 7, I have mezzo forte penciled in, which I think is in your handwriting. But then at 11, I just have myself marked down to play less.
In my copy as well, because I'm also working off of an old copy as well here, because I don't actually have a published copy of it either, just my old copies that I used to do. I don't have anything marked in there because I think the dynamic is probably going to match, but I then also appreciate that what you're saying about maybe thinking slightly less at that point. I think that's what you just said. And allow the piano to cut through the melody. I think that idea of the piano and piccolo working together to create the overall effect is very much, as we said earlier on in the podcast, that's what I really like. I really like both instrumentalists to be challenged and to be listening and aware all the time, certainly not a subservient role for the pianist at all. I think you're right. Maybe the piccolo should come down in dynamic a little bit there. And I will look through my UMP masters to make sure that that's been put in and to get something changed if necessary. So yeah, I agree. Maybe it definitely could come down a little bit in terms of dynamic there.
Yeah, I think that helps to actually make the two instruments blend a little bit more there, since the piccolo is going back and forth between the music and the staff and then going up to the higher register, that if you just think about pulling it back a little bit, it'll actually even it out a little bit more from what the piano is doing versus just being, on top of what the piano is doing. And then I marked in a crescendo for myself at the end of bar 12 to bring us into 13, which I, again, penciled in as forte, but I'm not sure that actually made it into any formal published copy.
It probably should have done. Yeah, I think you're right. I think the reason I put the tenuto on bar 13, the D sharp in bar 13, is because that's really where the previous two measures are heading towards. So yes, I agree, crescendo through there. Then keep the crescendo going all the way through bars 13 and 14. I know it's marked in 14, but just think through to that slightly changing character at 14 into 15. It's going to get louder, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I also was thinking that would help to set up, if you think about 13 as being pretty full, and then you can continue the crescendo in through 14, and then you can make that really sudden change, drop in dynamic at the 7/8 right at 16. That will help to set that up a little bit better to make that contrast happen. And then about that part right at 15 where he's got the nasty notation, this is a place that I absolutely use the tu and ku syllable for a double tone. And the reason that I say that is because I'd say probably about 80% of the time I prefer to use softer syllables on flute and piccolo. So I usually gravitate to using more do and gu syllables. But here, because he really wants this to be nasty, I absolutely use a tu and ku. That gives me that harder percussive sound to give that nasty effect that he was talking about before. And then I just do a slight crescendo from the accented note at the end of bar 16 to lead back into that lyrical, expressive idea that he presents again at 17. You've got to watch the pitch of the notes as you're doing that retard, going from the end of 19 into bar 20. He wants you to take your time, but just make sure that you're also being aware of your pitch on those last two notes, because they tend to want to go flat. Matt already mentioned about how bar 27 and 28, that they're actually just 3-note gestures that he's changed the octave designation on. I found it very helpful in that section to just go ahead and practice them as if they were all in the same octave. So going ahead and playing everything either down in the low octave or everything up in the middle register, just to get the fingering patterns together, which seems like a simple thing. And it actually makes it really simple when you do it that way. And then just keeping in mind the one note of the pattern that changes, that either drops down or comes back up. I just found that to be very helpful. The other thing that I think that is helpful in that passage, and again, this is also another little trademark of Matt's that he likes to put in his pieces. So if you look on to Sonata number 4 or Sonata number 3, he has some passages like this as well, but regrouping it according to how the notes fall in the register, so that you're not just thinking of one lolly and lolly, one lolly and lolly, but you're thinking one lolly and lolly 2, lolly and, so that you're leading through from one group to the next. Really helps it to establish a better flow through that, and doing lots of different rhythms to really get the technique smoothed out in that section. I found all to be very helpful. Again, I want to impress that even though it's a technical section, that you should still approach it from a very lyrical standpoint. This is something that I talk to my students about all the time, is that just because something is technical doesn't mean that you should throw the lyricism or the tonal control away. So I think the more expressively you can think about the passage and try to focus on that aspect, as opposed to how technically difficult it may seem or feel, that you'll actually have better success with it. Keep the air moving to support the fingers, and all those things will help. when we get to 33, he was talking about, keeping that staccato really short. And I do agree with that. It needs to have a good shortness to it, but I also want to impress that the piccolo can sound really too short and too chipped very quickly. So try to be as diaphragmatic with your staccatos as possible so that you still have a nice round sound, not long, but just a roundness to the sound. So it doesn't sound like it's just that you're spitting with the instrument. And I think doing a good crescendo from the end of bar 34 into where the solo piccolo takes over at 35, where you're just left on your own without the piano. I think setting it up with a crescendo beforehand just helps you go into that solo passage with a little bit more confidence, because you're just kind of left out there by yourself. So just don't be afraid to make going into that forte. I think, again, that's something that I penciled in that may or may not have made it into the published copy.
In my copy, it's not there, but again, I completely agree with you. Perhaps it should be. It's a really good suggestion.
Can you reference the measure number again, please?
Yes, it's at the end of bar 34. I basically have a crescendo written in starting on, what beat is that? 4th, 8th note beat. So just going to the end of the bar to really lead up to that forte.
No, that's really good, because I have a published copy and it does not show a crescendo.
Okay.
So that was a good suggestion.
I will write it in now and then get on my computer and send a new copy to UMP with these suggestions, because they're very good. Thank you very much.
I love the manuscript original versions and published versions and having different notes here and there. It's great just to see how it's evolved over time.
Well, actually, I think it's a really important one where actually composers, we listen to performers and we take their suggestions, and I'm always really open to performers coming to me with suggestions as to how they think something should go. I would usually have a pretty clear idea about how something should go in my head, but if you're not open to the ideas of someone suggesting something to you, I feel like you could be losing out. And, everything when people talk to me about how something should go, or a passage or something like that, I'm always open-eared about it, because, if you don't listen, you don't learn. And I know it's my work, and there'd be sort of, maybe, I could be sitting here saying, oh, actually, no, I don't agree with anything you're saying or anything like that. But the interpretation part from the performer is the thing that really sells the piece, and the thing that gives each performance its own characteristics. So I think the more we can open our ears and learn as composers, the better, to be honest with you.
That's one of the things that I really love working with Matt, is that even though he is a very accomplished flutist, which I think would make it even more difficult for a composer to kind of let their piece kind of grow in the hands of another flutist, because it's his own instrument. And so I would think that it would be doubly difficult, because you are also a player in that aspect and in that scenario, and to allow somebody else to have a little bit of creative input of how they hear the phrasing or how they want to shape it, I think speaks volumes to his open-mindedness, but also just willingness to experiment with other musical ideas and allowing the piece to grow with every performance, which I think is exciting.
Definitely. And just having that collaboration is very unique.
Absolutely.
Neat. Yeah. Are there any more comments on movement 2?
I have a couple more if you have time.
Oh, feel free.
So the piccolo takes over, just by itself in 35, but it's really important for the player to know exactly where the piano joins back in, which is on beat 3 of measure 36. So I have a big arrow there just to remind myself that this is where the piano comes in. Whether or not you need to give them a cue, or if it's just for your own benefit of knowing this is where it enters, but just knowing that you have to line that up because you're in the middle of a rallentando, and that can be a little tricky. Other than that, I have a couple more penciled in things that we'll check and see if they actually made them into the published version or not. At 41, it says cantabile and molto legato, and I have slurs written in over the first triplet, over beat 2, and then going from beat 3 and 4. And the same thing in the next measure. Did those slurs get put in the published copy?
Yes, they did.
Great.
Oh, good. One got through. Fantastic. Brilliant stuff. Excellent stuff. I thought we should do this podcast for all my work so we can edit them live on a podcast. That's perfect. It's brilliant. I'm glad that one is in though. That's fantastic. Brilliant.
You just found my Series 10 topic, Matt. It's going to be edits and fixes in composition. Speak to the composer and let's go through with a pencil and...
Learn to be an editor live on your next podcast. Yes.
I love it.
All right. So I do have a suggestion for helping to make this dynamic shift happen from measure 42 into 43.
Okay, great.
Great. So he wants it to stay forte from 41 to 42 and then basically a subito piano at 43. So if you can add as much vibrato to your sound on those last quarter notes in bar 42 to help keep the energy up of the sound. I know that it's in the middle register and it's somewhat difficult to play with a lot of volume, but that will at least give us the aural illusion of the notes being as loud and full as they possibly can. I do breathe right here on the downbeat, take a breath to help me just reset for that piano that's coming up. And then the high F sharp, you can actually use a really sweet fingering to help make that more piano than not. So the fingering is essentially the same as your regular high F sharp fingering, except that you are going to add your right hand middle finger and lift your right hand pinky. So I know that may be confusing on a podcast. So let me just go through the fingering from left hand to right hand. So left hand, it would be B natural thumb, first finger and third finger. Right hand would be second finger and third finger, no pinky. And you can get a very, very sweet sounding high F sharp with very little effort. It does tend to be on the sharp side, but if you're trying to play at piano, that should help to counteract that intonation difference. You can aim a little bit more down into the instrument to also help bring that pitch down. But you do need to try to play it as softly as possible so that you don't go out of tune on that. But it also just makes it speak easier. So definitely experiment with that fingering if you didn't already know about that one. In 44, I have slurs again that would match what we were just talking about in 41. So the triplet is slurred, beat 2/8 notes is slurred, and then beat 3 and 4 are slurred together, which I would assume made it in if measure 41 also made it in.
Yes.
Okay. And then I've already talked about the last note of this, so I think that's it for me.
Did you have something to comment, Matt?
I was just going to say, composer breathes a sigh of relief at another edit going into the published version. Excellent stuff.
And that's why I can't read back like my thesis or anything, because I am dreadfully scared of finding a weird comma or something and me just tearing out my hair and thinking, no, why did it make it into the final version? Oh, shoot. Because you painstakingly go through edits, in and out. And even like what Christy was saying earlier about collaborating and changing maybe this or that here or there, you wonder, oh, did it make it to the final version? So I totally get it.
Yeah.
Cool. So let's move on to movement 3, which is super fun, by the way, Matt. I played through it again before our interview, and after I was done reading movement 3, I thought that was a super fun movement.
Yeah, I feel like I took a long time to come up with this movement. The first two, as I said at the beginning of the podcast, were premiered, and there wasn't a third movement. And, immediately it was said after that premiere, oh, where's the third movement? And I hadn't had time to write it at that point. But it seemed to take a long time to come together in my head. I really wanted something that suddenly jars against the slightly slow, and lyrical, opening 2 movement. And I ended up coming up with this quite aggressive, agitated, movement, with the piccolo really showing all its technical fun and ability that it can do. I look back at the score and I think it really is quite an aggressive and fiery movement, and it's pretty loud as well. There's a lot going on in it. There's a lot of piano. There's a lot of double octaves, especially at the beginning. What I would say as a general overview of the movement is really, really go for it. Have as much fun and take it as fast as you dare. But then when the piano does drop out, say for instance at measure 11, really be as precise with your rhythm and articulation as you possibly can, and don't let the dotted crotchet pulse deviate at all. It's so very easy to get lulled into a slightly slower beat 3 with this movement. I know I found that when I played it. I was aware of this when I was writing it, having the dotted quavers at the end of the bar within the 9/8 bar is rhythmically fiddly and can be annoying to play. But I found just trying to keep the dotted crotchet pulse exactly the same the whole way through. So this sets up, again, it's the same as the first sonata. It's in 9/8, and I really like the dance-like quality of the piccolo, and that's what I was trying to get across, this energy and this sense of where's it going and what's happening now, hopefully cutting through. So that sets up, the melody still takes off and we get it in a couple of different octaves. And then the development of it starts to really happen towards measure 15, where we start getting these repeated notes in the piano and the piccolo decorating in 3/4 bars. The opening section of this movement, it kind of builds and goes away again, builds and goes away again. What I would love people to try and do is interact with the pianist as much as possible. Really just enjoy the energy that you can then suddenly express, having been relatively restrained in the opening 2 movements. The piece kind of is based around that opening 9/8 idea. But what I try to do, and I try to do this with a lot of pieces, is to link the movements of the pieces together, especially in the final movement, where ideas can come back and combine, and we get references to other movements, so that the piece sort of takes on a bigger structure rather than just a movement by itself. We get quotes from other bits coming back in. So, for instance, 46, measure 46. I'm directly quoting the opening movement. But it's at a slightly faster tempo, and the left hand of the piano is very, very much more energized. And what I try to do here is use the energetic 9/8, which we've had at the beginning, create something suddenly much more lyrical, between 46. And then, at 50, when I was writing this, I just thought the piccolo sparkled, over the top of the piano part. And I couldn't help but write that word in there. I think, the way the piccolo interacts with the piano, the way we establish C minor, it just allows the piccolo to be at its kind of dazzling, sort of like best of the instrument, I feel. I love the way the piccolo can interact with pianos. The way I write this section is very much decorating the opening movement's melody and trying to keep the energy of the movement alive as well. We then take an accelerando at measure 57 after that sparkly piccolo moment. And we get the agitato theme coming back, although not for very long. And then at measure 68, we have a cadenza for piccolo. And obviously, a cadenza is a chance to show off just some performance notes for this one. The opening of the cadenza can really be taken as much time as the performer wants to. When we get to the presto 9/16 section, the material is again an embellished version of the first movement, and I'm just looking for the piccolo player to push themselves to the limit of how fast they can play. And also using the cadenza as actually development of material as well. And then it slows down again at the 3/4 in the cadenza, measure 77, and we get this tick-tock feel going through the moderato accelerando, allowing the chance for some double tongue and show off, and then jarring us back into the movement's opening motif, and some fun scalic bits just to show off how fast you can move your fingers. And then it takes us through measure 85 into 86. We get a writ. You can really go for it on that writ. Take as much time as you like. Keep them guessing. The melody comes back then at 86 in a slightly modal kind of way. And the kind of energetic stuff reaches its climax 90 into 91 with a pause on the last dotted quaver. And originally in my head, I was going to finish it at that point, not how it's written now, but it was originally going to be finished there. But I kind of, because of the nature of the piece, I really wanted to try and end it on sort of bringing everything together. So I quote the second movement quite substantially, actually, at the end of this movement, and develop it and try very, very hard to link the opening movement themes together. I suppose really the crux of the whole piece is measure 98 in this movement. The high F sharp this time developed leading into the high G sharp. And in the left hand of the piano, you get this faint glimmer of movement 1 expressed. It's marked expressive in the left hand of the piano. And really that is the point where this kind of culmination of what's happened before reaches. We get the lyricism returning with all of this as well. And then the 2 bars of, is it 2 bars? I think it's 2 bars, 2 bars of piano solo. From 101 through to 102. Just a moment for the pianist to be as expressive as they dare with that. The piece then starts to unwind. The piccolo comes back in at 103 with a rit. And then because of the way the piece began, I thought I had to end it the way it began, almost like awakening from a dream, or I think Nancy Norse described it like that, actually, on hearing a performance of it. This idea of unease always being there. Are we really sort of in control of what we're doing, et cetera, et cetera. Do I know where I'm going? And the piece, I just thought, why not finish it in the way it starts, but with a little subtle difference at the end, in that the piano is now slightly higher in pitch than originally at the beginning, and then it just dies away with a very long pause on the last.
Thank you so much, Matt, for that feedback. I really appreciate that. Christy, do you have any comments on performance suggestions on Movement 3?
Absolutely. When I said earlier that this was a good piece for perhaps an intermediate piccolo player to kind of delve into, I think in terms of the first movement, that's absolutely true. The second movement starts to provide more challenges with control and technique. And then this third movement, it's really just off to the races. So you really have to, have some good control of your technical skills, both as a flutist, but, on the piccolo in order to be successful on this. So the third movement might be a little much for less experienced piccolo players, but still a really fun challenge, as you pointed out earlier. One of the things that helped me on this piece as I was learning it, and also just in performance, was I have a lot of indications throughout my score of what the rhythm of the piano part is, marked into my part, so that I know if the piano is doing a duple subdivision or a triple subdivision, especially in places where either I'm playing against the pianist or where I have a rest, so that I'm not confused about where that pulse is. Because as we have been talking about through this entire podcast, he's really trying to build on that sense of insecurity and instability. And so it really switches back and forth. Like even in the places where he deliberately changes it from a 9/8 to a 3/4, or from a 3/4 to a 6/8, there are still moments in those meter changes where it absolutely does not feel like the meter that he's indicated it being at that moment. So just, I think, penciling in some of those places where it might feel a little insecure, just to make sure that you line up with the accompaniment, is really helpful. Specifically, I have that written in right in the first bar that you come in, of bar 4. I have my 2/8 notes and then quarter notes, just to remind myself that I actually feel that as a 4/4 bar when I'm playing it, as opposed to a 9/8 bar, because that's the way that it lines up with the pianist. So I count it differently than what he actually has it marked. According to the meter, I'm counting it the way he actually has it grouped in the beats. And then it promptly switches back to the actual 9/8 meter in bar 3/4/5 as he has it marked. So again, this is just the way I think about it. It's not that it needs to be necessarily really changed. It's just, I think, helpful for really helping to secure the solo part with what's happening in the piano. Same thing at the end of bar 10. This was always a little place where it was tricky for me, and I have written in above my music the 2 dotted 8th notes and then 2 sets of 4/16 notes to show that piano lead in with the 2 sets of 4/16 notes going into bar 11 is helpful, so that you don't end up coming in early there. At 15, he marks it as a 3/4 bar, but I actually still feel this as a 6/8 bar until I get to 16. 16 is definitely feeling like it's a 3/4 bar. And then 17, again, for me, is a 6/8 bar before we go to the 9/8 that he has marked in bar 18. So the reason that I don't normally like to change the way that I'm thinking about groupings, because usually the composer does it in such a way that you absolutely have to play it with the meter that's indicated in order to get the proper accentuation. But in this case, if you look at bar 15, he's actually written the accentuation for the soloist as if it's still a 6/8 bar. So that's why I think that in this particular piece, that some of that is warranted, and it actually doesn't destroy the musical integrity. It actually helps to enhance what the composer was trying to get across. Now, feel free to jump in and tell me that I'm an idiot, Matt, if you don't agree.
What you're saying in terms of getting the performance is completely, completely valid.
Great. Do you have any other comments, Christy, about performance suggestions?
I do. Some things that, again, may be my own penciled in ideas, but I have written in places to try to put some shape into this piece because there is a lot of repetitive ideas that happen starting at 18, where we have this motive da 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 da, and then it goes up another step from there and it continues to climb. So just helping to maybe set that up by not being at max volume when you first started at 18, and allow yourself to have room to shape this going into bar 21. I feel like the whole phrase is actually headed to beat 2 of bar 21 as opposed to heading to the highest note, which is in the end of bar 20. So I tried to, save myself some room to continue to grow into bar 21 and then allow it to relax again and then just kind of start that process over a little bit. Again, when we get to 27, he's got that piano set up. So I would say try to be as healthy with your dynamic the measure before 27 so that you can really bring out that sudden change to piano there, and then just continue to grow all the way to the high G. The high G, it has a staccato. It also has an accent. There's a crescendo leading up to it. My suggestion is, again, coming from a singing standpoint for the piccolo, just to not let that note be too super short. You want to have some resonance to it so that you can show off the beautiful sound. I have a lot of accents marked in for myself that I believe Matt and I had discussion about. For instance, right at the downbeat of 35, I marked in an accent with a crescendo from the previous triplets leading up to that note. So that may have just been for my own notes, but I think it's a good idea to, lead into that downbeat and reestablish the beginning of that phrase. Sometimes it's easy to get lost on repeated notes, repeated figures. So in bars 37 and 38, I have brackets over the notes that repeat just to keep myself from getting lost on how many repetitions I've played or where I am in the pattern. So that can be helpful as well. 46. Now I have written in my part sinister. And again, I don't know if this was something specific that Matt had coined or if it was a term that I came up with, but I think you definitely need to make a contrast here of this bright, very typical, almost I dare say playful music, aggressive music for sure. But then at 46, it really needs to have a different character, and so I really like the idea of it being sinister. It's kind of weaving around, and you're not sure what's going to happen, what this new character is up to. But again, approaching it with a very lyric, very singing quality, really showing off the vibrato and the tone quality that the piccolo can have, especially in this really lush middle register. In bar 49, I have penciled in to listen to the piano's left hand to really make sure that you're lining up with the accompaniment. And then I actually put in a substantial retardando at the end of bar 49 with a breath before going back to the original tempo at 50. And I think this again may have been something that I may have added to the part. I basically just wanted to reiterate what he was saying about the cadenza, that he was pretty adamant with me about not doing too much slowing down of the parts of the cadenza that he marks as fast, that he really does intend for those presto section and the cello rondo and everything to really be a technical showcase for the instrument, despite maybe my idea of wanting to kind of build into those moments. He really just wants to take it off, like bat out of, nowhere, and really show off that technical aspect that the piccolo can achieve. So to just try to avoid the temptation of wanting to be too overly, free with that section.
No, that's great. I really appreciate that. So due to technical difficulties, listeners out there, the three-way conversation turned into a two-way conversation with myself and Christy. So we have decided to wrap up today's conversation about Matt Smith's Sonata No. 2 for Piccolo and Piano. And I just want to thank both of you. I know Matt can only hear me, but I can't hear your response. I just want you to both know how thankful I am for your talents and your time and your energy. It does not go unappreciated. And I want to thank you also from the flute community for helping us prepare for this NFA flute competition.
I just want to wish everybody good luck in the competition. And I also just want to say how excited I am that they have chosen one of Matt's pieces to use for the competition piece. His music is really important for the piccolo community, and I'm just glad that it's getting some more attention.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Matt and Christy, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. And I know Matt is winding down because it's late over there in England, but you take care, and hopefully we can meet each other at the next flute event.
Absolutely. Absolutely. He says he'd love to.
Okay. Thank you so much again, guys, and I will talk to you very soon.
Ciao.
Bye. Today's episode is sponsored by J&K Productions. They produce all of my episodes, from adding the intro and outro music to editing the audio and all post-production needs. Contact them for your next podcast project at jkproductions.media. Thank you for listening to the Flute 360 podcast. For more information, please visit HeidiKBigay.com. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please rate and review in the iTunes store. Let's talk about flute.